Hello everybody, today we're going to be looking at what I think is the cleanest way to sum an array, or in other words, add all of the values of an array together. Here you can see I'm in JS Fiddle. I've got the link to the JS Fiddle down in the description if you want to follow along. And we're just starting out with a little view instance. You don't need to be using view for this. I'm just using view for this because it's easier for me to display the results on the screen. So we're going to just start with a common scenario in which we might want to see our total number of views on our website. So we might have an array which is called views, and we'll get the last 3 days, which we'll say is 100, and then we'll say we had 50 on day 2, and let's say we had 50 on day 3 as well. And then one of the most common ways to create a total, which we're going to put in our total computed, is to use a for loop. So we'd do let total equals 0, and then we'd put for, and we'll do it the long way, let I equals 0, our condition, which is I is less than this dot views dot length, and then increment I each time through the loop, and then we put total plus equals, which is just a shorthand for add into the total, this dot views, and then our current index. So that will just loop through our values in our array and just add them to our total variable. And all we need to do is just return that, like so. And then if I run that, you'll see I've got 200 on the screen, which is the total views that we had over the last 3 days, as you can see in our array here. Now that's fine, but it's quite a lot of code for doing something really quite basic. A nicer way to do this is to use JavaScript's reduce function. So instead of doing all of that, we can instead get rid of that and hit return. And then we want to put this dot views, which is our array, dot reduce. And then reduce takes a function, and the first parameter of the function is something called an accumulator, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the second is something called current value, and we'll just call that val. And then all we do is we're going to use an arrow function here, which is just a shorthand for return in this case. And then we put add our 2 parameters together, acc versus val. And then we hit run, and as you can see, we've still got 200. And you don't have to actually sum these. If you wanted, you could also do find the maximum value, which would be math.max. You might be familiar with that function. And then that would just be acc val, and as you can see, if I run that, we'd get 100, and that would also be the same for min, which should return us 50, and it does, so that's great. But we'll just stick with summing for now. Let's put that back and hit run, and we've got our 200 back. Now, the way that reduce works is that it has this something called an accumulator, and this is the value of the result here. So our accumulator basically starts off at 100 in this case. So it starts off at 100, and our current value is 50. Now that's important. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but the value always starts off at index 1. An accumulator will either start off as index 0, in our case 100, or we can actually give it an initial value. But because we've got an array with 3 values, we can just do it this way, and we don't need to give it an initial value because we know the length of our array. So it starts off with accumulator being 100 and our value being 50. And so it adds those together. So it says accumulator plus value 100 plus 50 is 150. And then it feeds the result back into the reduce function. So we get 100 plus 50, 150. And so accumulator becomes 150, and value goes on to be the next index, which in our case will be 50. And so it adds 50 to our accumulator, and then because we've got nowhere else to go, we're at the end of our array. It returns our final result, which is 200. It's pretty much exactly the same thing that's going on with the math.max and the math.min. The accumulator is basically just the maximum value between 2 numbers, and it just keeps checking. So now we've actually managed to sum our entire array. We might want to just have a quick look at some of the gotchas with the reduce function. Firstly, you cannot have it perform on an empty array unless you give it an initial value. So for an accumulator, we would just have an initial value of 0. And if I run this, you should see it comes up with 0. We had nothing on there. If you don't give it a value, I don't think it will display on JS Fiddle, but if you don't give it a value, it actually throws an error. And I think it's a type error. Basically, there's no value. So it's really good practice to always set an initial value if you're not sure whether or not you're going to have any values in your array. Another common scenario is that we wouldn't necessarily be adding up an array of numbers. We may well be adding an array or be adding numbers from an array of objects. And so if we just get rid of the initial value for a second so that you can see everything that's going on. If let's say that we have an object and it has views in there, and we'll put 100. And if we put, I don't know, something like day, and we'll put Monday. Now, if we have this array of objects and we run this, actually what we'll get, surprisingly, is we'll just get this object returned because we only have one element. And the thing with the reduce function is that if there's only one element and we didn't set an initial value, it will just return that element. So it will return the whole object. So that's pretty confusing, as you can see there. It will return the entire object. Now, let's add a second object, sorry. So views, and then this one will be 50, and then we'll get day, Tuesday. Now, obviously, it doesn't know how to add two objects together, so if we run that, we get this object, 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 object. It doesn't really know what it's doing. But we really want to add together the views of each object. So at this point, you might be tempted to put accumulator dot views val dot views, and then if we rerun that, you'll see that that works. See, now it comes up at 150. Now, if you remember, these values get re-fed back into this reduce function. So what happens then when we add a third value? Let's have a quick look. We add the third value, views, and then we'll have 50, and then we'll have day, and we'll put Wednesday, like that. So what happens when we do that? If we run it, oh no, we've got not a number. And that's obviously because the first time through, it added 100 act.views to 50 val.views, and then it fed 150 back in. So the accumulator became 150. And so here, really what it's attempting to do is it's attempting to add 150 dot views to val.views, and that's obviously not a number. So you get this not a number return. So if we want to add an array of objects together, our best bet is to use a map so that we can map the array back to numbers. So we do map, and I don't know if you've used map before, but we'll do map, and then we'll just call this obj, and then for each one we'll put obj dot views, and then we call reduce on that. So now what we've basically done is we've mapped all of the views into an array of numbers. So if I run that, oh, we've still got not a number. Hold on 1 second. Oh yes, there we go. I forgot to actually take out the that bit there. Hold on a second. And if we run that, yep, so there we go. We get the 200, our result. And let's just take away the reduce for a second so you can actually see what map returns, which if I run that, you see that it just returns our views array, but just as all the numbers. So basically where we started at. Let's just control and Z, there we go. And that's pretty much everything that you need to know for JavaScript array reduce. As I say, best practice, always put in an initial value. In the case of summing values, that would just be 0. So this would be a fairly standard function, or in our case computed, and a way of actually summing values together. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know it can get a little bit complicated with some of this JavaScript stuff because it doesn't do everything that you expect it to do, but hopefully I've talked through most of the points. There are obviously a few more things with reduce. For example, you can pass in an index, and I think you can pass the array in as well. And we didn't look at that because generally you don't need to use it, but there might be scenarios in which you do. If you like the video, put a like on down below. Hit subscribe if you like these kind of videos, and I'll keep posting more. And I shall see you next time.